Lecture 1. Myth and Meaning.
When I was in grade school, we had a set of books in our school library called Junior Classics, one volume of which was dedicated to classical mythology. It was, of course, scaled down for a grade school reading level. I'm guessing of something like 6th grade. The stories had been heavily expurgated to get rid of a lot of the sex and violence, and I'm sure that they had been cherry-picked by publishers and educators in the 40s and 50s for those that would be appropriate for grade school sensibilities. But they were illustrated, and in the combination of the illustration and the story made for some really exciting reading. And it was in those books that I first came across, had my first experience with characters like Heracles and Perseus and Demeter and Persephone and Athena and Zeus and Odysseus. As we grow up, we discovered that those stories can still be exciting, but one of the things that happens is as we grow up, we tend to set those things farther and farther aside. And I think that part of the reason why we do this is because as we grow up, we become less and less sure of what to do with them, how to deal with them. If they do contain some kind of value or meaning for us, we're not quite sure what it is. We don't know what kind of relevance stories like that might have for an adult sensibility and an adult consciousness. And I think part of the problem with this is the fact that simply by calling them myths, we are connoting that in some way these are fantastic, imaginative, imaginary stories. They are simply not true. If we look up in any dictionary definition, a dictionary will give us 5 or 6 definitions of myth, but they all have that implication that this is not true, that there's something totally imaginary about what we're reading. The dictionary that I just happened to look up when I was thinking about this has as its first definition that a myth is a story focusing on the deeds of gods or heroes which purports to be true, but which is of use to historians only for what it reveals of the culture that produced the myth in the first place. The second definition and the third definition will give us the same kinds of things. A later definition suggests that a myth is an imaginary or fictitious person, thing, or story, which doesn't suggest much truth value. And the last definition in the dictionary I looked up said that a myth was a collective opinion based on false premises or the product of fallacious reasoning. Given definitions like this, it's no wonder we give them up as we grow up. But we also know that there has to be more to myths than just this. I spent my career teaching literature, and when we teach works like Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream or Dante's Divine Comedy or Kafka's Metamorphosis, we know very well that we're teaching something which is not literally true, which is not factually true. But somehow the idea, every literature course is based on the premise that there is a kind of truth involved in literature, and what literature classes are designed to do is to simply help us understand and learn how to read them in such a way as to get at that kind of truth. We also know that these days you can get a PhD in mythology, and we can teach other people how to read myths in college classes. Some of the books that I'll be suggesting that you might want to read as we go through this course are textbooks that are used in courses like that in college campuses. But the question still is, what kind of truth are we talking about in myths? How do we get at it? How do we understand what that truth value is? What are some of the techniques we have to learn as we're reading myths? To begin with, myths are narratives which most often deal with the very biggest questions that we are going to ask in our lifetimes. How did the universe come to be? How did we get here? Who are we, and what's our proper relationship to the cosmos and to each other? Given the larger forces that we recognize in the cosmos, how should we behave? How should we relate ourselves to those larger forces? Other myths, other kinds of myths which deal with slightly different questions, ask about the history of our country, the history of our people. How did we get here? How did we come to be who we are? What forces went into the shaping of our particular set of beliefs and values and behaviors? Who were our heroes in this process, and what does it mean to be a hero anyway? When we say someone does something heroic or somebody's a hero, what does that mean? There are still other questions, and this one verges closer to religion, and that is the question of who and what the gods are. Most myths have gods in them. If we think of gods as being personified or anthropomorphic in some way, what kind of way, or if they are simply representations of the larger forces in the cosmos, we still have to ask, what do they stand in for? What do they represent? What is it that we understand the gods doing, and how do we read them when we come across our own myths? There are a lot of other human constructions that deal with the same kinds of questions that myths do. Religion deals with a lot of the same questions. Science deals with a lot of the same questions. History deals with the same questions. And the fact that religion and science and history give back such different answers from mythological answers may contribute to our sense that myths are simply erroneous, that myths are simply bad science or bad religion or bad history. We'll be talking more about these issues as we get through the course, but perhaps here, before we start out, a word or two about the relationship between mythology and religion on the one hand, and mythology and science on the other hand, would be in order. The first thing to be said about the relationship between science, or between religion and myth, is that a myth can only be a myth if you don't believe it, if you stand outside it in some kind of way. If you stand inside a myth, then it becomes something quite different. It becomes divine truth, it becomes sacred, it becomes holy writ in some kind of way. So that Moses parting the Red Sea or Jesus' resurrection are clearly myths to Buddhists and to Hindus. Muhammad's night flight to heaven looks like a myth unless you happen to be a Muslim. Joseph Smith's discovery of the golden tablets looks like a myth unless you happen to be a Mormon. All of Vishnu's incarnations as Krishna look like a myth unless you happen to be Hindu. The fact that Buddha was born from his mother's side after his mother had a dream of a white elephant looks like a myth unless you happen to be Buddhist. Osiris begetting a child on Isis after he's already dead looks like a myth unless you happen to be inside it and believe it. So that perhaps the first principle to remember here in terms of the relationship between science or between religion and myth is that one person's myth is another person's divine truth. And the same story can be told, and it looks like a myth to one person, it looks like sacred truth to another. The other interesting question, and this is one that we'll come back to more often, is the relationship between myth and science. One of the things that we probably won't say as often as we should during the course of these lectures is that most often the myths as they are created use the best science available at the time, so that very many of the myths can tell us a great deal about what people thought as answers to scientific questions at the time the myth was created. But there are other overlaps between science and myth, which we can get at, I think, by telling a story. The story comes from Eva Thury and Margaret Deviney's Introduction to Mythology, and they do a shortened version of a raven story, the raven being one of the great heroes of the Pacific Northwest. In this story, Raven decides to get the water back. A character named Petrel has taken all the water on the earth, and he's hoarded it. He keeps all the water for himself. So Raven decides to go, the earth is drying up, there's drought, there's famine, all kinds of problems, so that Raven decides he has to get the water back. So first he has to get inside Petrel's house, which he does. Then he has to trick Petrel into leaving the house, which he does. And as soon as Petrel is out of the house, Raven takes all of this water that's been hoarded, puts it in his beak, and then takes off. He flies out through the chimney, and according to the story, a raven started out as white. He becomes black from the soot that he picks up going through the chimney. And then once he's outside the chimney, he takes off with his beak full of water. As he flies, he's being chased by Petrel, and as he flies, he begins to drop this water. It falls out of his beak, and wherever it falls, it creates a river. And so the great rivers of the world are created by Raven flying across the landscape, dropping water out of his beak. Science gives a different explanation of how rivers get formed, but the two accounts, in fact, perform some of the same work. What they both tell us is that the world is not quite orderly or predictable, that survival in this world requires a certain cleverness and flexibility. We may even have to change our colors to fit the circumstances that we're in. Rivers, if you look at them from the sky, look like they may have been dropped out of a fleeing bird's mouth, and they did allow people to map those rivers and thus to master their environment. Again, this is not literal truth, but it does contain a kind of truth. Clyde Ford, in a book called The Hero with an African Face, said that, in fact, in a way, mythology picks up about where science leaves off. The mysteries that lie behind all of life, our relationship to the earth and its cosmos, how to pass through the stages of our lives, how to integrate my life with the life of my community. These are not questions that are easily answered with a telescope or a microscope, but they are answered based on the experience of people who have lived through these, who have lived through centuries, and who have used their myths to bundle these truths in ways that they can pass on to us. We can illustrate this kind of truth again, the kind of truth that we have been talking about as the truth of mythology, with a different kind of myth. This one again comes from Thury and Divini, and they take this story from a book by Jan Harold Brunvant called The Vanishing Hitchhiker, American Urban Legends and Their Meanings. He calls this story Alligators in the Sewers, and it was collected orally. This exists in the oral tradition. That is, when Brunvant went out and got these stories, he collected them from people who told these stories all across the country. Presumably all these stories are based on an article that actually appeared in the New York Times in 1935, which claimed that an alligator had been found in the sewer. By the time Brunvant collected his oral versions of this myth, it had been greatly elaborated on. It explains where these alligators came from in the first place. They were presumably gifts that were given to little children in the 1950s when, for a brief time, alligators made a kind of a fashionable gift. When the alligators got too big or too dangerous, they were flushed down the toilets, and there they are. They wind up in the sewers. And in some versions, they have become albino because they've been living in the sewers so long that they never get to any sun. And they live by eating the rats that also live down there in the sewers. Now, if I were to ask you whether you think this story is literally true, I would bet that most of you would say probably not. And I would guess that if we went out in the street and had asked the first 100 people going by if we think the story is true, they would probably say no, not literally true. But Thury and Divini say that underneath this, the really pleasant, there is a kind of truth underneath what is clearly, or at least we hope, is a literally untrue story. What they say is that what the story captures, that in some ways, our understanding that beneath the pleasant surface of civilized life, there are some scary and terrible things. Every city is built over a maze of tunnels and subways and sewers and water pipes and electric lines and abandoned structures. In psychological terms, we know that a maze is a kind of symbol for the unconscious, which we have to explore in order to become fully adult. A dark maze full of albino alligators eating rats may be a perfect symbol of the fear of our own underground places. In cities, we also walk on a thin veneer of concrete or asphalt which masks unmentionable physiological and biological processes that go on underneath, beneath the skin, beneath our skin and beneath the skin of the city. And alligators in the sewers may suggest our own fears of city life, the kind of biological and instinctual parts of our lives that we don't want to know very much about. And it's really interesting that when we get to lecture 22, we will be dealing with an epic poem called Gilgamesh, which is written about the time that people first began to live in cities. And it's interesting to notice how many of those fears, which might very well be expressed in the alligators in sewers myth, show up very explicitly as people learn how to live in cities for the very first time. There's also this fear that we have when we live in a city. It's also a fear that we have of other people who live there. If you live in a city, you live with people that you don't know very many of or don't know very well. And so that it's possible that when somebody flushes a metaphoric alligator down a metaphoric toilet, I may have to deal with that alligator later on, even if I don't know the people who flushed it down. Every city inherits problems from those who have lived here before, and those people provide the ruins on which our own cities are built. As Thury and Divini say it in a very, very neat little phrase, I think, they say that alligators in the sewers expresses the uneasiness that most of us feel about other people's monsters. So that, again, what we get to see is that there are different kinds of ways of understanding how to read myths and different kinds of truths we can find in them beyond the literal or the factual. There are, of course, ways and ways and ways of reading myths to get at this kind of truth. And since this is going to be a course in myths rather than mythology, we won't be spending a lot of time on the various schools that have grown up over the years teaching us how to read myths, certain kinds of myth criticism. We'll do some of this as we go along, and we'll especially stop and do this when we get to our unit on tricksters, which is the 4th unit in this course. And then we're going to deal with some hypothesis about this very odd combination of qualities that make up the trickster. But the study of myths, which we're not going to actually spend much time with, we'll do it as kind of ancillary way. The study of myths is a really interesting study in its own right. That's a whole field of study all by itself. If you're interested in pursuing some of this, I have 2 really good sources, places for you to go. The one is a book by William Doty called Mythology, the Study of Myths and Rituals, and he has a whole chapter set aside to the different schools, different ways of interpreting myths. The other one is a book by Leonard Scott and Michael McClure called An Introduction to World Mythology. It too has a really good chapter on the ways in which myths have been read down through the years. Both of them have good bibliographies, so if you're interested, this would be a good place to start. In our course, we'll probably use a more or less eclectic approach to mythography, to the reading of myths. In Doty's book, he has a little section that he calls a mythographer's toolkit, in which he supplies us with the kind of tools that he thinks would be useful for us to have as we approach myth. He divides them up into 5 aspects. First, the social aspects. What kind of social work gets done by a myth? The second is the psychological aspects. What kind of things can we learn about ourselves from the kind of things that happen in myths? The third one is what he calls the literary aspect, and what he's primarily interested in here is to discover whether the myth comes out of the oral tradition or whether it's written down, whether it's a text somewhere. He also talks about what he calls the structural aspects, and structural aspects, he doesn't mean just the way a myth is structured, but structuralism, we'll get to this later on in the course, is a particular kind of French-inspired anthropology whose avatar is someone like Claude Lévi-Strauss, for whom structuralism is a specific way of dealing with myths, and we'll talk about that when we get there. The 5th of his tools in his toolkit is the political aspect. And in the political aspect, he simply wants to know what kind of political work does a myth do? How does it help to justify the way we organize ourselves, the hierarchies we arrange in our political and social structures? We can add to that another great scholar of myth and religion over the years, Mircea Eliade, who in his many books argued that myth should be understood as a branch of religion, that religion and myth overlap to a great extent. So we will talk about Eliade and his idea of religious aspects of myth, so we'll add a religious aspect to our toolkit as well. And then finally, as I told you earlier, I spent my life teaching literature, and there's some overlap in the way we can treat myths and the way that we treat literature. Some of the same techniques we use in explicating a poem or a novel we can use when we're talking about myths. I want to wind up today by giving just a couple of sample myths and just taking a look to see what kind of truths we might find in them. First, I want to quote from David Leeming in a book called The Oxford Companion to World Mythology. In the introduction to that book, he mentions 3 myths. The Hammer of Thor, which comes from Norse mythology. He mentions the Travels of Gilgamesh, which come from the Sumerian epic poem. And then he mentions the Passover from the Old Testament. As he said, all 3 of these events are probably mythical in the sense that they are questionable as literal truth. Probably none of the 3 are really quite literally true. But, he goes on to say, when we think of these stories mythologically, they take on an importance, a truth, without which we would lose our very identities as cultures and as humans. Thor's hammer conveys a Scandinavian and ultimately a human sense of a terrible and wonderful power of fertility in the universe that is difficult to explain in any historical or scientific sense. The travels of Gilgamesh express the ancient Sumerian Babylonian search for meaning, a search that is metaphorically still very much ours. The Passover story speaks to the sense that a culture, but also humanity itself, is somehow unique, and that humans do best when they make proper use of that uniqueness in relation to the larger mysteries of the universe. We can deal with, what he's talking about is the fact that all three of these things, while not literally true, possess some kind of truth that we would be much the poorer for not possessing. I think we can illustrate this with a couple of myths that we'll take a brief look at here. We'll come back to both of these and talk about them in more detail later in the course. The first one is the myth of Heracles. Heracles was the son of Zeus and a mortal woman, a woman named Alcmene. When he was born, he immediately invoked the wrath of Hera. Hera was a very jealous wife, and she always disapproved of children that her husband had by other women. And so from the very time that Heracles is born, he becomes the target for Hera's wrath. As an infant, she sends 2 huge serpents into his cradle to try to destroy him, which he manages to defeat the serpents. As Heracles grows up, he gets married and he has children of his own, but Hera hasn't forgotten him. And so at one point, Hera sends a huge fit of madness upon him, in which fit of madness he kills both his wife and his children. Then, totally overcome by remorse, by shame at what he's done, he undertakes a whole group of kind of atonement actions, and those atonements become the great 12 labors of Hercules. He eventually winds up committing suicide falls on a funeral pyre, but afterwards he is given immortality by his father Zeus. This is very rare in Greek myths, by the way, that someone is given immortality. If, as Thury and Davini point out, they're the ones who list this in the first part of their book, if we ask what kind of truths are in here, there are all kinds of different kinds of truths in this myth. The madness suggests in some ways the kind of limits on human freedom that we all struggle against. The atonement that Heracles feels that he has to undergo shows that even a good man has to atone for his actions, even if those actions were beyond his control, even if he didn't mean to do any of them. The immortality that he achieves that Zeus gives him at the end of the story, in a way, is kind of metaphoric for the sort of fame that is achieved by other heroes whom we'll look at later in this course. Specifically, I'm thinking now of someone we'll run across in Lecture 22, and that is Gilgamesh, who comes home from his own literal quest for immortality, realizing it's going to be a failure, he can't achieve this, and discovering that his only chance at immortality are the great walls he has built around the city of Uruk, and that every one of those bricks in every one of those walls is stamped with his name. That is his immortality. We can also look for psychological aspects, use Doty's psychological tool here, and we can see what happens to Heracles is he's alienated from his father very early. His father, in fact, sends him off to servitude and even to slavery for a long period of time. And there's so many ways in which we can see that in the character of Heracles, that he's performing his great tasks to prove that he's worthy of his father. He's trying to win the love of his father. And his character throughout his entire myth is in part driven by the pain and confusion which is caused by his father's rejection of him. And so, once again, we can see that there are many, many different kinds of truth that a myth can contain aside from the literal and the factual one. One more example. The last example, this one is from Leonard McClure, and it is the creation account from the Mayan epic poem, The Popol Vuh. In this myth, the gods take 4 tries to get human beings created properly. And what the gods want to do is they want to create creatures who will give them service and who will praise them and who will give them sacrifices. The first time they try to invent these creatures, they invent animals. It turns out animals can move, but animals can't talk. Animals can't do sacrifices. They decide this is not going to work. This is a failure. So they banish these animals out to the wilderness, out to where they are going to be food for the next generation, and then they start with a second try at making human beings. The second time they make them out of mud and they turn out to be able to talk, and they seem to work out all right, but they are very fragile. I always imagine that they must disintegrate when they get brought in contact with water, so this one doesn't work out very well. So that whole creation has to be destroyed as well. The third generation of humans is made out of wood, and the wooden ones turn out not too bad. They are sturdy, they can talk, but they turn out to be bloodless and dry and affectionless. And they also don't pay much attention to the gods. So here, once again, the gods decide they have to destroy this whole race of humans. This one turns out to be more troublesome to destroy because by this time they've multiplied, there are a lot of them around. So that they first of all send a great flood to destroy this third creation. Then secondly, they send demons down to finish up the work that the flood doesn't do. And then finally, in the last analysis, all of these peoples, these wooden peoples, pots and pans and utensils and furniture, everything they own rises up to attack them. So that's the end of that one. And the fourth time they make human beings, they make them out of maize, out of yellow and white corn. And this one works. This is the one that finally turns out to be the ancestors for all of us. In fact, they make them a little too good. They turn out to be better than they really intended them to be. In fact, they can see so far that there isn't that much difference between these new human beings and gods. So what the gods do is they have to scale them back a little bit. They undo their creation slightly. It's just like putting a mist over a mirror. You blur their sight so they can only see what's very close at hand, and then they have it right. Now, if we ask what kinds of truths there are in this myth, there are truths of all different sorts. Scientists and historians can use the myth to show that the cultivation of maize was achieved very early by the Mayans. Historians and anthropologists can reconstruct the kind of material life of these people from all those flying pots and pans and furniture. And it's all very carefully described. And so we can tell by all these things that come flying and attack these wooden people, we can tell what their inside of their houses must have looked like. And we also can tell from the myth that there was a great knowledge of seeding and soil and taking care of growing plants and seasons and all of this. All of this we can get from the myth. But there's a metaphoric myth here too, and this is the one that perhaps goes beyond what we can find in any other discipline. The fact that it took 4 tries to get human beings right seems important. In Genesis, we are told that humans are the crown of creation. It's the last thing. God created everything, and then on the last day, he added humans to this, and he saw that everything was very, very good. The Mayans had to feel that way about themselves too. They had to feel they were pretty good because it took 4 tries to get it right until the gods got it exactly the way they want them. And it also, metaphorically, we can tell that the Mayans saw themselves as children of the corn. Anthropologists know the importance of corn from decorations that are found in their houses, from farming implements, from the ruins of granaries and farms. But the myth tells us that the Mayans themselves knew this. They knew corn's symbolic value, and they knew that it had value for them way beyond its economic and sustenance value. So myths, again, as always, as we've been saying over and over during this lecture, myths are both false and true. Finally, before we end this first lecture, let me say one word about world mythology and about what that's going to mean in this course. Over the next 35 lectures, we'll be looking at a lot of myths from all over the world. We'll be comparing them and looking for shared threads. And what will inevitably happen is as we put them side by side, we will notice certain similarities in myths that comes from very different parts of the world, from very different stratas of human time. We're going to discover that there are some common denominators, some common threads. And what this will tempt us to do, what's tempted a lot of people over a lot of time, is to look for a certain universal myth. That is, that myth which transcends cultural boundaries and somehow tells the story, the myth about human beings. We'll talk about this in much more detail when we get to our unit on heroes, where the idea of this universal myth, or a monomyth as it's sometimes called, will be very much to the point. But it's a tricky concept. Not everyone believes in the monomyth. We can illustrate why not with the Mayan myth. Maize was an obvious choice for a maize-based culture. The Greeks wouldn't have told their story in the same way. They had no maize and they had different conception of human beings. So that these historians would say that each myth wears clothes of its own culture. On the other side, it is also true that no idea of any single culture will ever capture the entire human sense of God or creation or the hero. And to get a more complete human picture, we have to look at the myths of many cultures. We can tell a lot about a specific culture from its myths. We can tell what Greek culture was like from Greek myths, and they're different from Japanese and Chinese and Cherokee. But if we could put all of these culturally bound conceptions side by side, perhaps something of the human conception of these issues